Hi, my name is Troy Smith, and I'm a history professor. Odds are, if you're watching this video, um, I'm now your history professor. By the way, don't call me Mr. Smith. There's no need for that. Mr. Smith is my dad. I'm Dr. Smith. Now, some of you may know me already, perhaps from having taken my classes before, in which case you may have already heard this introduction that I'm about to give. But that's okay, because this is history, and you know what they say, history repeats itself. Actually, that's up for debate. But what's not up for debate is that historians repeat themselves, especially me. So, it doesn't hurt to hear it again. And by the way, you'll have to bear with me if I repeat myself in the course of giving these lectures, because sometimes I talk to so many people I lose track of what I've already said and to whom. Anyway, here we are in what is probably, if you are watching this and you were a student, one of the Gen Ed basic survey history courses, which might be History 2010 at Tennessee Tech, which is the first half of U.S. history, or 2020. I'm doing double duty and just recording this thing for all my classes this COVID semester. So anyway, some of you may be what they call history buffs, and most of you probably are not. Some of you were anxious to take this class and learn more about history, and many of you perhaps not so much. Perhaps many of you are here because you're required to be here, because this course is required in the state of Tennessee for your degree. So perhaps you're a little bit apprehensive about what this semester and what this course will bring. Now, I want you to know that especially at the college level, history instructors have, well, all professors have a lot more latitude than in, K through 12, where there's often specific things mandated that you have to talk about, and you're told how you have to do it. We're given more leeway. Oh yes, but that's okay. That's a good thing. Now, that does mean that you could take the same course from two different instructors, two different professors, and it would be substantially different, even though they would be talking about the same things. However, there are some things that all historians have in common. The first being they're all historians and thus deal with history. Now, I want to start this course by talking a little bit first about what is history, and then why is it important and why should you care. Now, the first question on the surface sounds like it would have an easy answer, but if I were to ask you to define history, and if we were together in person, I would, what would you say? How could you accurately and succinctly define the word? It's like a lot of other words. You know what it is, but sometimes it's hard to articulate. Now, when I do ask that question, what is history? A lot of times the answer that I get from students or, whoever else I'm inflicting my questions upon, most common type of answer is things that happened in the past. And that is true. History is about things that happened in the past, but that is not a full and accurate definition, because there are other fields of study, like, for example, archaeology. What does archaeology deal with? Things that happened in the past. So is an archaeologist a historian, and vice versa? Now, they may use some of the same tools and try to get at some of the same answers, but they don't do it in the same way. history is not just things that happened in the past. Here's another example. Have you ever heard the term prehistoric? Well, if something is prehistoric, it happened in the past, but it's not history because it's pre-history. So, just to kind of quit beating around the bush and to make a long story short, because you're not here for me to torture personally, I will give you the answer. History specifically is the study of the past, primarily through documents. Documents, mostly documents from the past, which are primary source material. And sometimes by looking at things about the past that were written after the past, but before, after the past events, but before the present. Those are secondary sources. And sometimes that includes stuff that is just now, coming out even. A history book is a secondary source. But primarily history is the study of those documents. It's done by using the archives. Now, what is an archive? I don't know if how many of you are familiar now with Indiana Jones and the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Remember, there was this scene, well, if you've seen it, at the end where the Ark is being filed away in this giant warehouse that is full of other objects, kind of just lost in the shuffle there. Well, a lot of archives are like that. I like those kind of archives because there's lots of stuff there. But plenty of things can be an archive beyond just a building with books and objects in it. An archive is where documents about the past are stored, and like I say, that could be in any number of places. So documents from the past, what sort of things would those be? Again, if we were here in person, I would be, asking for volunteers to give me examples of documents from the past. And newspapers is usually one of the first things that people think of. So newspapers, diaries, journals, correspondence, letters that people write back and forth to one another. I have a friend whose primary field of study is letters home written by soldiers in the Civil War, and all number of things can be learned that way. So, newspaper articles, letters, diaries, also people's memoirs and autobiographies, which add some time into the mix, right? Because even if you're the one who experienced something, if you're writing a memoir, that is not from the moment. That comes from a later time, and we'll talk about some of the issues that can arise there in a moment. But there are other things that people don't normally think of when they think of archives, but which are valuable artifacts. For example, government documents, deeds, wills, census reports, but also things like sales records and receipts, which you wouldn't think, that's not the first thing probably you would think of when it comes to examining the past. But, actually, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but when writing was developed, and of course that's where the prehistory comes in, right? Because history doesn't start until people started writing things down. And before that, it's prehistory. But writing developed roughly around the same time, independently of one another, in Mesopotamia and in China. And in both cases, the first evidence of writing, apparently, was merchants keeping a record of what they sold, bought, and traded. So that is a long-standing set of historical documents. I have a friend who did his doctoral research by looking at the ship's manifest of all the ships coming in and going out from the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina in the 18th century. And you can learn all kinds of valuable things. Other stuff, popular culture, literature, paintings, stuff like that, that can, paintings, art history. I have another friend who did a project wherein he looked at the joke pages of Playboy magazine over every issue for decades, and didn't look at anything else. But he was tracing what people found funny over time and how that changed. So there you go. That's a valuable resource. So sometimes you have to kind of think outside the box, but it all comes down to, is it something that is a document that's from the past? If so, you're dealing with that. You're not just recording it. Okay. This is the difference between history and antiquarianism. Between studying the past and just listing things. When I asked the question, what is history, I could have prefaced it by giving you some examples in the past of how people had defined history. Like Napoleon said, history is a myth that men agree to believe. Lord Chesterfield, British statesman, called history a useless heap of facts. Henry Ford said history is more or less bunk, which doesn't mean a bed you sleep on. You don't hear that word so much in the 21st century, but bunk, a bunco artist, scam artist, BS, in other words. But Arnold Toynbee is generally considered to have originated the phrase, although other people have laid claim to it, that history is just one damn thing after another. And that may be how you have felt from your previous experiences with history courses, right? They're lists of things you have to memorize, names and dates and places, just a big long list of them. That's not really history. There used to be these things called encyclopedias before they wikied up, where you could just get the basic facts about something. But just getting the basic facts is different from what a historian does and what real history is. Real history is an effort not to categorize or list things from the past. It's an effort to understand them, to understand what happened, why it happened, and what the consequences are. One of my co-advisors in grad school called that the so what question. You could put together a list of any number of things from the past, and your audience could say, so what? Why do I need to know that? Why is it important? That's where the work of a historian comes in. Looking at those documents and extrapolating from them, gaining some understanding about the basic human condition and about the condition in the present. You can't understand the present without understanding the past. But it does make a difference how you go about understanding and examining the past. And I kind of hinted at that earlier when I talked about memoir and autobiography and the passage of time. Now, let's think about this. Let's think about the difference between history and memory, both of which deal with the past, and which can kind of go back and forth and morph one into the other in some ways. let's say that here we are. Let's say it's the year 2020, and you're working on a paper for a class about the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And let's say that you actually know someone who was there. They would have to be, in their 90s now. So, not impossible. It could happen. Would it be beneficial to talk to this person who was actually there and get their perspective and their memory on what happened? Or let's say that it's 10 years ago and the person was in their 80s. So maybe their memory would be a little sharper, though you never know. It varies from individual to individual. Would it be beneficial? Would it be helpful to your project? Well, obviously it would be. Now, I have just within the last year or two met and talked with several World War II veterans. Some of them with better memories, more recent short-term memories than others, but all of whom had vivid memories about their youth, and especially about that experience. And you can learn a lot. You can learn a lot about the feelings associated with those events from someone who was there than you can from reading some dry account. But here's the question. If you had the opportunity to talk to this, let's say, 92-year-old guy who was a young sailor at Pearl Harbor, and he told you what happened that day, and let's say that he had been interviewed by a reporter on December 8th, 1941, the day after it happened, and asked the same questions, would his answers have been exactly the same? Would the story have been exactly the same? Well, we know it wouldn't be exactly the same. There would be slight differences, and sometimes maybe not so slight differences. Does that mean you don't talk to the 92-year-old guy? Of course not. You do. But you also have to look at what was said and done at the time, because memory is tricky. I'm going to demonstrate that because this is just how I roll. Looking at a couple of my favorite movies. Unfortunately, we're not going to watch them. I'm just going to show you some the posters from the movies and kind of talk about the plots to give you an idea of why I am using those as a vehicle to examine the difference between history and memory. All right, let's go. All right, first, let's talk about Rashomon, the 1950 Japanese film directed by Akira Kurosawa and starring one of my favorite actors, Toshiro Mifune. Now, some of you may have seen this, probably most of you haven't. I highly recommend both these movies, by the way. Rashomon is often included on critics' lists of the greatest films ever made. And the reason that I bring it up is because of the plot of the film, which I'm going to spoil right now by giving it away. It's based on a famous Japanese short story, by the way. So, the plot involves a samurai and his wife who go out for a ride in the forest where they are attacked by a bandit played by Toshiro Mifune. And the bandit and the samurai fight. The samurai is killed, and the bandit rapes his wife. Now, all along, there's a woodcutter, a peasant, who's working nearby, who hears what's happening and hides because he doesn't want to get killed, and then later comes forward after the bandit is captured. Now, this is all just the beginning of the movie. The movie itself is essentially the trial of the bandit, in which everyone gets to tell their side of the story. So the bandit tells his side of the story. The samurai's wife tells her side of the story. Because this is 12th century Japan, they get a spirit medium in to raise the ghost of the samurai, and he tells his side of the story. And then, of course, the woodcutter, who is a neutral observer, tells his side of the story. All four versions of the story have the same facts, the same events take place in the same order. But do you think they are the same story? Of course not. It's four very different stories featuring the same events, because it all depends on the perspective and the motivation of the person telling the tale, right? The bandit is trying to present things in such a way that he can both brag about his own exploits and also save his life. The samurai's embarrassed because he got defeated in this duel. The wife is humiliated, and even the woodcutter's biases enter in. Well, I won't tell you how it ends, but having described that plot, perhaps that sounds extremely familiar to you, even if you've never seen the movie. And that's because that basic plot has been imitated many, many times since 1950, so that it's almost become, it has become a trope of its own. And even outside of movies, that in court cases, you can have eyewitnesses and eyewitness testimony, but the jury always has to take into account the reliability of that testimony. Now, there's a famous story too about several blind individuals being asked to describe an elephant, but they only get to touch one part of it, right? So you're going to get different stories. That's the point, is that even with the same events, perspective and motivation influence how the story turns out. Okay, so that's the point there, and that happens with historical events. Even when you go to the original sources, you have to be able to kind of evaluate different perspectives, but it's especially true. It's especially true after the fact, when you are looking at things that were written after the fact, because memory plays tricks on you. There have been studies in which people who experienced certain famous traumatic events were asked about those events later, after having a certain information that they could not have known at the time sort of casually pointed out to them. And they then incorporate that into their memories, and they remember those things as though they knew them at the time, which they did not, or as though they witnessed them, which they did not. So that's that movie. All right, then on to Apocalypse Now, which came out in 1979, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, fresh off of making the Godfather Parts 1 and 2, based on the Joseph Conrad novel Heart of Darkness, except that it moves the action from 1900 Belgian Congo to the Vietnam War. It is it's a very surreal movie, and, well, very, very good. One of the best films of the 1970s, and the 1970s might have been the best decade for films. But none of those things are why I want to talk about this movie, because unlike the previous one, we're not looking at this one because of the plot, but rather the process. So here's what happened. Francis Ford Coppola made this magnum opus. Took a long time to make, and there were a lot of difficulties on the set. Finally finished it, and wound up with a film that was about 3 hours long. Took it to the Cannes Film Festival, where it won top prize This is before it had been released in theaters. Won top prize at Cannes. However, distributors balked a little bit. They thought that it was too long to play in theaters, that audiences wouldn't sit still for that long for such a surreal experience. And so he was forced into a situation where he had to cut roughly about an hour out of it in order to get it down to what distributors thought was a manageable size. So he wound up with a 2-hour movie, which still made an impact and was regarded as a very powerful and important movie, but it also was regarded as so surreal as to be kind of dreamlike and kind of beyond comprehension. So a lot of people were thinking, this must be a work of genius because I can't understand it. And the fact is that all that stuff that got cut out was the stuff that made the story make sense, right? So in reality, the film as originally envisioned might have been surreal, but not as surreal as the final product. Well, about 20 years later, Francis Ford Coppola released the editor's version, the edited director's cut version of the film called Apocalypse Now Redux. And that's the one I recommend you watch because that's the one that, makes more sense. So when you watch that film, it's a completely different experience than the first one because that hour has been restored. And now we come to the part as to why I'm talking about this movie at all when I'm talking about history and memory. You see, he didn't just take out all the scenes. He didn't just replace all the scenes he had taken out in exactly the spot they had originally been and restore it to the condition it had been in when it won that Palme d'Or prize at Cannes. No, what he did was he took all the scenes, basically laid them out in the editing room, and built the whole thing over again from scratch. Not in the same order as before, not in exactly the same way. And you had a powerful and moving film, but it wasn't exactly the same film, even as the previous 3-hour version. Certainly not the same as the 2-hour version. So that I like to describe that because that's kind of how memory works. Every time you call forth a memory, you don't have the whole thing stored in your brain like a computer file on a computer. Different elements of it are stored in different parts of your brain. So every time you remember it, you are reconstructing that experience so that the smells, the sounds, the textures, the things that you saw all get mixed together. Sometimes it gets mixed together with things that you have learned since then that you didn't know at the time, and that subtly alters how you remember things. So that it's like this movie, or like a John Lee Hooker song. He never sang any song the same way twice. So it's a creative process, and it works for us as humans, but it is fallible. It is fallible, and it has to be regarded in that context with the knowledge that that's how memory works. It's not like something that was captured on video from a single camera, moment by moment. And that happens not just with individuals and their memories. That happens with groups of people. Cultural memory. There is such a thing as cultural memory. It's the things that a group of people, a community, use as kind of their foundation for their past. And it can change with time, particularly not just within the lifetimes of individuals, but with generations of people. That collective memory of how things were and what happened and how they got there shifts little by little until you wind up with something completely different from what actually happened. Well, we're going to look at a couple of examples of how that can happen. Now, we're going to look at the town of Farragut, Tennessee, which is in Knox County, right outside Knoxville. It's kind of like a suburb, really, of Knoxville, although it's an incorporated town. And at this point, when we were, if we were meeting live, I would ask the students, how many of you are from East Tennessee? And then I would say, how many are from Knoxville, the Knoxville area? And then I would ask, is anyone here from Farragut? And usually, several people from Knoxville, and usually at least one or two from Farragut. Why are we talking about Farragut? Well, when I ask those questions, and I'm asking them of you, my virtual audience. So if you're from the Knoxville area, or you're just familiar with the Knoxville area, you know about the town of Farragut. And so I will ask, if you've been around the Knoxville area, have you ever seen Confederate flags in the Knoxville area or in the town of Farragut? Because I used to work in Knoxville, and part of my job was actually in Farragut, and I saw stuff like this all the time, which is not the least bit unusual in the American South, right? I mean, I grew up in Middle Tennessee, in the Upper Cumberland region, in Sparta and surrounding areas like Cookeville. So, this is just part of the atmosphere, and you will frequently hear people talk about the Confederacy as part of their Southern heritage and a way of honoring their ancestors. And you find that stuff in Knoxville, just as you find it in Nashville in Middle Tennessee, or Memphis out in West Tennessee. But the fact is that East Tennessee was overwhelmingly pro-Union, which is not to say that there were no pro-Confederate people there. There were, but they were decidedly in the minority. Most people in East Tennessee were pro-Union, to the extent that East Tennessee almost seceded from Tennessee to stay in the Union, just like the western counties of Virginia did, and became the state of West Virginia. So East Tennessee almost became its own state, purely out of rejection of the Confederacy. But if you were just traveling through East Tennessee, you wouldn't guess that, because there's still that attachment, that nostalgia for the Confederate flag as part of their Southern heritage. The fact is that if these are people whose families are traditionally from East Tennessee, that probably isn't their heritage. They probably fought against that flag. In fact, the town of Farragut wasn't always called Farragut. The area was originally known as Campbell's Station, and the name was changed to Farragut after the Civil War because it was to honor one of their native sons, David Farragut, from that town, who became essentially the commanding naval officer, commanding admiral of the Union Navy. In fact, he was the first U.S. naval officer to attain the rank of full admiral. And that doesn't make him an outlier. There were a lot of prominent Union officers who were from East Tennessee. But that's not how it's remembered. And in fact, it extends, right around the eastern edge of Middle Tennessee, right around where you get to Cumberland County. That's where the shift started to occur. So you had, majority pro-Union in the east and a vast majority pro-Confederate in the west, and a slight majority pro-Confederate in Middle Tennessee, but there were a substantial number of pro-Union people in Middle Tennessee. And I had actually a friend of mine that I went to school with discovered that in his family tree was a Union officer in the Civil War, and he was just absolutely flabbergasted because, so far as he knew, none of his family came from the North. Well, that doesn't matter. You didn't have to be from the North to be Union, and coming from the South didn't automatically make you Confederate. So, Confederacy does not equal Southern, and Southern does not equal Confederate, at least in the context of that war. However, there was a change in how people remembered it in this region after it was over, something we'll be talking about quite a bit later on. The next example of the trickiness of cultural memory pertains to American war casualties. There's a phenomenon that occurs when people publish charts showing American war casualties. And so what I did here was I Googled American war casualty charts and did an image search and captured the first 3 images. And this is what we came up with. On the upper left-hand corner, this is from the website of the magazine Business Insider. You have total U.S. casualties by war. And the wars, you'll notice, are in chronological order, starting with the American Revolution, ending in Afghanistan. Now, this one has all casualties. That includes people who were wounded and people who were missing and people who died of disease and accidents during the war, in addition to those who were combat fatalities. All right, so there's that one. Over on the upper right, from American Prospect, American War Deaths. This one also is in chronological order, starting with the Revolution, ending with Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the first one separated Iraq and Afghanistan. These other two lumped them in together. So this one is a bar graph showing the number of deaths specifically in each of those wars. And you can see that the American Civil War had the most combat fatalities, and World War II was second, and everyone else was way back there, right? Okay, well, next, the lower left from American Battlefield Trust. This also is a bar graph. It kind of combines the first two we looked at. It's a bar graph, but it doesn't have them in chronological order. It has them in descending order from the highest number of combat fatalities. And again, Civil War way up there at the top, World War II second, and then everyone else, it gets, well, obviously it's descending order, so it gets smaller till you get down to the Gulf War. Now, the numbers on these charts are not exactly the same. I guess it all depends on your source, but they're all roughly about the same. So when we get down to the Gulf War, 258 fatalities, as opposed to almost 400 from American Prospect. Spanish-American War, as you can see in all these, was not an especially fatal war so far as the number of people killed. Far more than the Gulf War. Gulf War, you may not even be familiar with that, I realize now, because it's before most of you were born. It was in the early 90s, as early in the 90s as you can get, like late 1990. Spanish-American War, we got 2,400 killed in in both Battlefield Trust and American Prospect, and the total number of casualties altogether for the Spanish-American War is a little over 4,000. As you can see, it barely registers on these charts. Now, why am I showing you this stuff? What does it have to do with anything that we're talking about? Well, because I want to contrast it with this chart, which this one happened to have come from Wikipedia. There's something different about this chart. Now, it too has the total number of deaths, and it is not in chronological order. It is in descending order from the most deaths, right? So American Civil War, World War II, World War I, right up there in the top three. But there's something different about this one. So take a look at it for a second and see if you can notice the difference. Now, by the way, this one is not all wars. It is the top 10 deadliest American wars. Hopefully you've noticed what that difference is. This one's got a war in it that the other ones don't have. Now, those first three that we looked at, that is probably 90 to 95% of any charts that you look at that, have those American U.S. war casualties. And most of them leave off this one here at the bottom, coming in at number 10, the Philippine-American War. That's not one that jumps immediately to most people's minds. And that's because most people don't even know it happened. Maybe you did, but odds are you didn't. If you were to just walk down the street and stop people at random and ask them to tell you about the Philippine-American War, I think you'd probably go through several people before you found someone who could actually tell you anything. Although you might get lucky and hit one on the first try. But if you did several people, very few of them would even mention this or, in fact, even know about it. Now, how on earth could that be? Is it because it was such a small war that it didn't register? No, because in the top 10 here, it cracks the top 10, comes in at number 10, but that is ahead of the Gulf War, but it's also ahead of the Spanish-American War, and I bet all of you have heard of the Spanish-American War. This war with the Filipino people had twice as many U.S. military fatalities as the Spanish-American War. Now, maybe this one never gets mentioned because it was shorter than most wars. Well, no, take a look. 1899 to 1913. Now, it was the first 2 or 3 years where most of the fighting took place, and there was sporadic fighting in the southern part of the Philippines for several years afterward. But still, that's 14 years. You know what that makes that? That makes it the second longest war in American history after the war in Afghanistan that we are still in. So that's not what it was. The Gulf War and the Spanish-American War, they make all these charts, and each of them lasted less than 6 months. So what is it about the Philippine-American War that keeps it from being so well known? Well, I'll tell you what keeps it from being so well known. No one's ever told you about it. They don't talk about it much in public school. I was a history nerd growing up. I loved American history, and I read all kinds of stuff about. I won the awards for American history. I got medals and stuff in high school. I had never heard of the Philippine-American War until I was a freshman in college, and I took the first half of U.S. history. That's the first time I'd ever heard of it. Why does it not get mentioned in high school textbooks? Well, to be honest, in recent years it has started to be mentioned, usually like one sentence, not enough to stick in your mind. Before that, for decades, it wasn't even mentioned at all. So it was a long war. It was not the most bloody war in American history, but it was bloodier than several that always make the lists. Well, let's take a brief look at this war and figure out why it has been lost to cultural memory. Not been lost to history, because you can go back to the original documents from the time. You can look at newspapers from 1899, 1900. You'll find headlines about this war. So it's back there, but it doesn't get mentioned in secondary source history books. Doesn't get mentioned much in school. Well, you'll notice it started in 1899. You will also notice the Spanish-American War happened in 1898. Did I say 1899? I sure meant to. Anyway, so yes, this is right on the heels of the Spanish-American War, and it was kind of a continuation of it in a way. It's also referred to, and for the longest time, this was exclusively what it was called when it did show up at all in history books, as the Philippine Insurrection. But in recent years, historians, and now finally other people, have started referring to it as what it actually was, a war. See, an insurrection implies a rebellion. It implies someone rising up against proper authority. That's not what this was. All right, well, there on the left, you see Emilio Aguinaldo, one of the great heroes of the Filipino people. So the Philippines was under the control of Spain, and it had been at this point for 350, maybe almost 400 years by this point. And, just like Cuba. Cuba was Spanish-American War. The U.S. invaded Cuba to take it away from the Spanish because, well, it's a complicated story. But the claim of many people was that they wanted to liberate the Cuban people. Same thing with the Philippines. Let's liberate the Filipino people. And the Filipino people were already working hard to liberate themselves. They had been engaged in a guerrilla insurgency against the Spanish for years. Aguinaldo was the leader of the Filipinos. So, when the United States, during the Spanish-American War, came to the Philippines to fight the Spanish there and defeat them in the Battle of Manila Bay, Filipino people were delighted because now the yoke of the oppressive Spanish has been lifted from them, and they can do what they've been trying to do for all those years, establish themselves as an independent country. And that was the understanding, that the U.S. was going to come there, liberate them, and help them establish themselves as an independent country. So they drew up a Declaration of Independence based closely, and a Constitution, both based closely on the American documents. And they had an election and elected Emilio Aguinaldo as their first president, which was all well and good until they were informed by the U.S. government, hold on a second. See, we defeated the Spanish and you're a Spanish possession. That means that you are now a U.S. possession. And we can't let you run your own country because you are uncivilized and don't know how to do it. Now, have you ever heard the expression, white man's burden? That's kind of the philosophy of European and American imperialists in the late 1800s. Noblesse oblige is another way it's sometimes described. Noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobility to protect the peasants and make their decisions for them. Well, that expression, white man's burden, comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling. The poem was called White Man's Burden. Hopefully you are familiar with Rudyard Kipling, if nothing else, because he wrote The Jungle Book and Rikki Tikki Tavi and The Man Who Would Be King and a lot of other stuff. That poem that he wrote, called White Man's Burden, all about how people of European descent are naturally superior to the non-white people of the world, and are obligated from a sense of Christian duty to go around the world, Christianize those backward people, and make their decisions for them. And he complained in his poem that they never seemed to appreciate it. That poem was written in defense of the United States action in the Philippines. Well, the Filipinos had been fighting against the Spanish for years. This happens, so they just keep fighting, only now it's against the American occupiers. And shortly after the U.S. arrived, an American soldier shot and killed a Filipino guerrilla, and the fight was on. Large numbers of American soldiers served in the Philippines during those many years. And it was a rough war, because the Filipinos didn't have an army that would match the United States, just like they didn't have an army that would match the Spanish. So they engaged in guerrilla warfare. Well, the policy of the U.S. Army and the Marines, the military in general, during this insurrection, as they called it, as we called it, because, hey, we're supposed to be in charge and you're not going along with the program. The policy was, well, in some cases, as in the painting there that commemorates an occasion when the U.S. Army burned down an entire Filipino town. And what they would do, because they suspected that Filipino civilians were supporting the guerrillas by giving them food and other things, is they would come in, empty the town, sometimes burn it down, and they would take all the people and herd them together into compounds that they built. They would concentrate them together in camps, which they called concentration camps. And as they tried to, catch the guerrillas, they did things like waterboarding, which is where they pour water on your face. They put a cloth over your face and pour water over it so you feel like you're drowning. That was banned by the Geneva Convention and made into a war crime in the early 20th century. And in fact, the U.S. government executed several Japanese officers after World War II because they had waterboarded American soldiers. But this isn't waterboarding that we're looking at here. This is something similar but different. It was called the water cure, or the water treatment. And if they were trying to get someone to talk, to tell them where the guerrillas were, so these are usually civilians, not always, sometimes captured guerrillas, but civilians often, including Catholic clergy from among the civilians. What they would do is they would stretch them out, as you see right here, and sometimes inserting a tube down their throat, like you see on the left. Other times, like on the right, they're using a kind of a funnel, I think. Just keep pouring water down the throat of the prisoner until, and you can see this starting to happen on the right, fill them so full of water that their bellies would swell up. And when they swelled up as big as they could get, the American soldiers would jump up and down on them until they burst. They also referred to them as, what we today more politely designate the N-word. Even though they're not people of African descent, but they are non-white. The soldiers who were engaged in this stuff were desensitized to it pretty quickly, many of them. And they started writing home to their parents, telling about, what's going on, what's an average day like, telling them about these things they were doing. And a lot of people back home started to kind of freak out because this didn't sound like the kind of thing American soldiers should be doing, especially at a place where they're supposedly there to liberate the people. And then just the idea of coming in to liberate the people, but taking them over and making them into a possession didn't sit well with a lot of Americans either, including this guy, maybe you've heard of him, Mark Twain. who was extremely outspoken. He was a member of the Anti-Colonialist League. It was this big organization of people who were opposed to the U.S. government occupying the Philippines instead of giving it to the Filipino people. Because, well, some Americans felt like making someone else into a colony isn't what America was about, because it was established by colonies who rebelled, right? So there was a big outcry. It was in all the papers constantly. And as more and more things came, more and more descriptions of what was happening got to the public, there were investigations into American war crimes, investigations that went all the way to the halls of Congress. It was a huge, huge controversy. And finally, it became so controversial that the U.S. withdrew many of their troops, but not all of them, because they still hadn't quelled the Filipinos, the Muslim Filipinos in the southern part of the Philippines. That took many more years. Now, Teddy Roosevelt became president a couple of years into this. He was there for when it was the most controversial. When he wrote his memoirs about all the things he had done in his time in office as president, he never even mentioned the Philippines. And neither did anybody else for a long time. Why? Because it was very, very embarrassing. It was very embarrassing. It seemed very hypocritical. Although, you got to give credit to the huge proportion of American citizens who protested against this, to the point that eventually the whole thing was kind of slowed down. But the Filipinos didn't get their country back until after World War II. Well, when I was at the University of Illinois as a teacher's assistant to a professor in a U.S. history class, some of the students, one student in particular, did their research paper on the representation of the Philippine-American War in American textbooks. And they went through all the textbooks. The University of Illinois has a huge library. All the textbooks that have been used in American high schools since, say, the 19-teens. And what they discovered was, it's not in there. It was in there for a while during the 19-teens when it was still happening or had just happened. Then it just stops being mentioned completely. And it doesn't get mentioned for generations. Not until the early 1990s. In the early 1990s, you started to see a little bit mentioned about it. So it stopped around 1920. Didn't start being talked about again till the early 1990s. Well, most of you were not around in the early 1990s, but there is something very, very significant in American history and world history that ended in the early 1990s. And, we're a long way from getting to the discussion of that time period. But you're familiar with it, I'm sure, although not personally, the Cold War. Right? The collapse of the Soviet Union happened in the early 1990s. When did the Soviet Union begin? The late 19-teens, the Russian Revolution. 1917, firmly established by 1918, 1919, which started the first Red Scare, as everyone around the world was freaking out about communists. And that's when they stopped talking about the Philippine insurrection in textbooks. And they didn't even start to mention it at all again until the Soviet Union fell. So that's a 70-year period. Why is that? Well, during the Cold War and really the 25-year build-up to the Cold War that started when the Soviet Union became a communist country, there was a competition, right? A competition between East and West, capitalism and communism, a competition to win over the hearts and minds of neutral countries around the world, trying to get them to side with one or the other, right? From the perspective of the United States, you don't want people talking about the fact that you came in to rescue an oppressed people, took over their country, tortured them, put them in concentration camps, and all that stuff. You don't want anyone to talk about that. And you especially didn't want anyone to talk about it in the 1960s and early 1970s during the Vietnam War. Because what I have described to you as happening in the Philippines is remarkably similar to what happened in the Vietnam War. So in other words, it is extremely embarrassing. And so no one talks about it. Because it's not in the textbooks, even though it's in the primary source documents, but because generations of kids didn't get taught about it, I bet 90 to 95% of Americans don't even know that it happened. And it was a big deal. It was a much bigger deal than some of the wars that we do have in our cultural memory. Does that kind of freak you out a little bit? That something that important could happen and no one really knows about it? It should. It should. It shows, it shows the importance of knowing your history and going to the original documents. It also shows that cultural memory can be unreliable because it can be manipulated and it can be tweaked. And that brings me to this illustration. Yes, we are now jumping all the way back to ancient China because, again, that's how I roll. All right, well, in ancient China, and China is not the only place this happened. It also happened in Egypt, various other places. But this is China's where this term comes from. So that's why I'm talking about them. The mandate of heaven. What is a mandate? Mandate is having the support, right? So if there's an election and one person wins overwhelmingly, they will say, let's say an election for president, they'll say that they're going to serve as president with a mandate, right? Because overwhelming majority of people supported them in the job. Well, you're probably familiar with this from World Civ classes, European history classes, the idea that in Europe, all the way up into the Middle Ages, there was this thing called the divine right of kings, right? So why is a person king? Because God wants him to be. That's why. That's why you can't rebel against the king, because God put him there so you'd be rebelling against God. That is a very handy way to stay on the throne if you're a king. That's a really good way to make sure you've always got support, right? God will get you if you don't support me, because if he didn't want me to be king, I wouldn't be. And that's how things ran in China as well, with emperors of China. And much like Egypt and the Roman Empire, there were dynasties, right? And like the Pittsburgh Steelers. But anyway, dynasties in which multiple generations of people from the same family would rule over the empire. And they would kind of cement their position by saying they have the mandate of heaven, right? The heavens, God must want me to be in charge, or else I would not be in charge, so you have to do what I say. What happens, though, when someone decides to rebel against the reigning emperor, and it succeeds, and they overthrow the emperor. Allegedly the emperor was in place because of God putting him there. Well, this is what would happen when such a thing would come to pass, and some rebel would come along, overthrow the emperor, and establish a new dynasty. How are you going to convince the people God's on your side? Well, by changing the history, by changing the written histories of the previous dynasty, changing them in such a way that subsequent generations would look back and they would see a record of that previous dynasty being increasingly incompetent and immoral, whether they actually were or not. That's how they would be presented in the new histories: incompetent and immoral. Because they were incompetent and immoral, clearly heaven is not going to support them anymore. Heaven is going to put a highly competent, highly moral person in charge, like me, the new emperor says. Well, when that happens, can you just imagine that you are just a common citizen, a farmer, and one of these revolutions occurred, and dynasties change, and now all the history books say the previous dynasty was corrupt, incompetent, and terrible, but this one's great. And you actually remember. Maybe the previous group wasn't great, but maybe they weren't all that bad. And maybe you remember what actually happened, but that's not how it's written down. That's not what your children and grandchildren are going to be taught. And so, cultural memory and history itself gets changed. In a case like that, that's where cultural memory actually has a very, very valuable job. Because if you're that farmer and you know that's not what really happened, you introduce a counter narrative to your kids. You tell them what really happened, and then they pass that on to their kids, and then there's this other narrative out there. And eventually, that could evolve into legends, but it's going to stay alive, right? Now, that kind of points to a weakness in looking at written documents. If you look at the documents of the time and then they all get destroyed, and then other documents counter argue against them, that makes it difficult. That makes it necessary for the professional historian to search for context clues and read between the lines. Now, here is where the modern world and the United States has a bit of an advantage over, let's say, a 1,000-year-old empire. The U.S. isn't that old, comparatively speaking. And the U.S. was being established, what would become the U.S. was being colonized right around the time that the printing press was being invented. And the printing press, by the way, played a huge, huge role in the American Revolution. And how that becomes an advantage is that, official histories can be rewritten if they're written on, perishable scrolls or tablets or whatever. But we actually have the original documents. You can actually find newspapers from the 1700s. You can actually go and see, they won't let you touch it, but you can see a copy of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. So that's a bit of an advantage. Also, the fact that we live in this digital age, that's got some pros and it's got some cons. The cons include the fact that anybody can say anything and a bunch of people will believe it just because it's on the internet, right? Just because something's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. But living in the digital age means that those original documents have been scanned and preserved, and if you are dealing with a reputable source like a university that you can trust that hasn't altered anything, then even without traveling to the Smithsonian or somewhere like that, you can read the original documents from the time period that we discuss in my class, the establishment of the United States all the way up through the Civil War and things like that. You can see the documents and you can see what people were saying at the time, and that helps you to cut through the fog of cultural memory. It helps you to get a closer grip on what was actually said and done, rather than relying on what other people tell you was said and done. If you find some of the things that I say in this class a little hard to swallow, I urge you to find copies of the original documents that we're talking about and check it out for yourself. Verify that I'm being straight with you. Okay? So, that brings us now finally to really the crux of this very long conversation. Why is history important? I'm going to begin by making a bold assertion. I make this at the beginning of every semester when I teach the basic survey U.S. history courses, and I realize it may not be true for everybody, but I hope that it is true for most of you. And here's that assertion. One day you will look back on this class and regard it as one of the most important classes that you took during your college years. And that will happen no matter what your major is. And that's because at some point in your life, and it very well may have already come, you're going to look around. You're going to look around yourself. You're going to look at what's going on in the world. And you're going to think, well, gee, this sucks. I wish that I could do something to change it. And the fact is that you can. You see, this arc of history, this narrative, which I do think that there's a flow to history, especially U.S. history. It is not a story of extremely important people at the very top who one day decided to change things and said, things change, and they did. That's not how it has worked in American history. Rather, change has come from the ground up. Change has come from a whole lot of people, average people, normal people, people like you and me, working together to try to change things that they saw needed changing. Now, U.S. history United States history, obviously, is going to begin with the Declaration of Independence, because that's the moment at which there was a United States, right? Although we'll be looking, in my classes at times well before that. But U.S. history, in my opinion, the 18th century, the founding of this republic, is a story of some very flawed human beings trying to come up with a plan that works, and they came up with a really good plan that more or less has stood the test of time, but which needed adjustments as time has passed. And like I said, those adjustments usually have come from the will of the people, right? So if we're talking about the abolition of slavery, which at one point looked like a virtually impossible thing to do, the abolition of slavery, gaining the vote for women, the end of segregation, lots of other big things, the labor movement, lots of things that only came about because people like you, people like us, worked together and pushed at that seemingly immovable door, and also pushed at their elected representatives, who only listen really if it seems like votes are at stake. So you can make a difference, but the first step to being able to do that is what we're doing right here. The first step to doing that is learning how things work, learning how things got to be the way they are. You can't fix something unless you understand it. Now, sometimes I've heard even some of my colleagues, not in the history department, but some of my colleagues around campus complain that their students are being distracted from their major because they're having to take these history classes, and what good is it? What good is looking at the past? We're trying to build the future. You can't build anything unless you understand what you're working with. And the issues, many of the issues that we're going to be talking about in this course come up every single day, still, in this country. And if you're going to engage in them, you have to have a deeper understanding of them. Now, we do that as historians by looking at the documents, looking at the primary source documents, as I've been sort of pounding home over and over again. So some of those documents that we examine and some of the things that arise from them may surprise you over the course of this class. There may be some things that we see that run counter to what you always thought, or maybe what someone else has told you. And that's okay. That's okay, because that sharpens our understanding. And you have to realize, too, that in addition to looking at those documents and seeing what people were actually thinking at the time, it also works just like memory works. You when you do that, you are also engaging the things that you have learned since then. That's why it's important to keep looking back at the same events, because we've learned more since then. And this is true. This is going to be true for you no matter what your major is, no matter what profession you wind up in, no matter what end of the political spectrum you might happen to fall on. All this is going to be very important for you. This is one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." I believe that, but I also acknowledge it is long. It is a process that perhaps will never be completely finished and perfected. But if you are well equipped, if you are well armed with knowledge, you can participate in that process in a profound and meaningful way. All right. Well, all that being said, we should probably actually start talking about the history of what we're talking about, right? So let's get started.